There are things they never say out loud, not because they can't, but because if you understood them, you would never look at them the same way again. You've been told narcissists are confident, powerful, irresistible. But what you were never told is that behind that mask is a deep, restless hunger that is never satisfied. And when it comes to intimacy, that hunger becomes their most dangerous weapon. Because for a narcissist, intimacy is not connection, it is control. They don't approach you with desire the way a healthy person does. They approach you like a strategist walking into a battlefield. Every word, every touch, every moment is calculated, not to bond with you, but to bind you. And here's the part that shocks most people. The attraction you felt wasn't entirely real. It was engineered. They study you. They watch your reactions. They notice what makes your voice soften, what makes your eyes light up, what makes you feel seen, and then they become that, temporarily. It feels electric. It feels rare. It feels like you finally found someone who understands you on a level no one ever has. And that's exactly the illusion they want you to live in. Because once you're emotionally hooked, intimacy stops being something shared and starts becoming something used. They will intensify closeness quickly, overwhelming affection, intense eye contact, deep conversations that feel almost spiritual. Not because they are deeply connected, but because speed creates dependency. What you felt was not an accident. It was constructed with precision, shaped in real time, designed to feel like destiny while functioning like a strategy. They don't step into your life hoping to connect. They step in scanning, observing, collecting details the way a profiler studies a subject, watching your tone, your body language, your pauses, the things you linger on, the things you avoid, the invisible patterns that reveal what you crave most and what you fear losing. They notice the way your voice changes when you talk about feeling understood. They catch the flicker in your eyes when you describe what you've been missing. They hear the silence behind your words when you say you're fine. And in that moment, they don't feel empathy. They feel opportunity. Because intimacy to them is not about mutual vulnerability. It's about access. Access to your emotions, access to your trust, access to the parts of you that not everyone gets to see. And once they gain that access, they don't treat it as something sacred. They treat it as something usable. They begin to mirror you with almost surgical accuracy, reflecting your values, your humor, your pace, your desires, making you feel like you finally found someone who speaks your language without translation, someone who just gets it without effort, someone who feels like home without time. And that's the moment the hook sets in. Because your mind starts to relax, your guard drops, your skepticism fades, and you start leaning in emotionally before you even realize what's happening. It feels natural, effortless, almost too perfect to question. But perfection, when it arrives too quickly, is not connection. It's construction. They accelerate intimacy because speed bypasses discernment. They move fast not because they're overwhelmed by you, but because they don't want you to have the time to analyze them. They create late-night conversations that feel raw and real. They share stories that seem vulnerable, but are often curated. They hold eye contact just a second longer than normal. They create moments that feel charged, almost cinematic, like something out of a story you've always wanted to live. And while you're experiencing it as connection, they are measuring your response. Every reaction you give becomes data. What makes you open up? What makes you trust? What makes you attach? And once they map that out, they begin to reinforce it. They give you more of what pulls you closer, not out of care, but out of strategy. Because the goal is not to know you, the goal is to anchor you. And the deeper that anchor goes, the harder it becomes for you to question anything that follows. They blur the line between emotional and physical closeness in a way that feels seamless, almost magnetic, so that your mind begins associating them with comfort, excitement, safety, and desire all at once. This is not random, this is layering. They are stacking emotional triggers on top of each other until your attachment feels undeniable. And in that state, you stop evaluating, you start believing. Believing that this intensity must mean something real. Believing that no one else has ever connected with you like this. Believing that this is rare, special, once in a lifetime. But what you're feeling is not depth, it's saturation. They flood your emotional system so quickly that you don't have space to separate what's real from what's performed. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. While you are opening up, becoming more real, more exposed, more invested, they are staying in control. They decide when to move closer. They decide when to pull back. They decide how much of themselves to reveal and how much to keep hidden. So while you think you're both building something together, you are actually stepping into a structure they've already designed. And because it feels so aligned with what you've always wanted, you don't question the foundation. You only feel the impact. You feel seen. You feel chosen. You feel like you matter in a way that hits deeper than logic. And that feeling becomes addictive. Not because it's healthy, but because it's rare in your experience. And they know that. They know that if they can make you feel something you haven't felt before, you will protect it. You will defend it. You will hold on to it even when it starts to hurt. Because now it's not just about them, it's about what they made you feel. And that's where intimacy turns into control. Because once your emotions are tied to them, they don't need to force anything. They don't need to demand your attention. You give it freely. You start thinking about them more. You start adjusting yourself to maintain the connection. You start prioritizing them in ways you don't even notice at first. And all of this happens while they maintain just enough distance to stay in control. They are close enough to keep you engaged, but distant enough to avoid accountability. So when something feels off, you don't immediately blame them. You look inward. You question yourself. You wonder if you're overthinking. You try to fix something that was never yours to fix. And that's the brilliance of the strategy. Because the more you doubt yourself, the more control they gain. The more you try to understand them, the deeper you get pulled in. And the more intimate the connection feels, the harder it becomes to walk away from it. Because walking away doesn't just feel like losing them, it feels like losing the version of yourself you were when you were with them. The version that felt alive, seen, desired, understood. But that version of you was real. The way they accessed it was not. And that distinction is everything. Because once you realize that intimacy was used as a tool, not offered as a truth, something shifts inside you. You start to see the pattern instead of the person. You start to recognize the design instead of the feeling. You start to understand that what felt like connection was actually control dressed in the language of closeness. And that awareness, that clarity, is the one thing they can't manipulate once you truly hold on to it. What keeps you there is not love, it's the pattern. A pattern so subtle at first that you don't even notice it forming, but powerful enough to rewire the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you respond to them. In the beginning, everything flows. Attention is consistent, energy is high, communication feels effortless, and you start to settle into a rhythm that feels safe, predictable, almost secure. And then, without warning, that rhythm breaks. Messages slow down, tone shifts, presence becomes inconsistent. The same person who once leaned in now pulls back just enough to make you feel it. Not enough to walk away, just enough to create doubt. And that doubt is where the cycle begins. Because your mind doesn't like unresolved patterns. It wants closure. It wants clarity. It wants to return to what felt good. So instead of stepping back, you lean in. You replay conversations. You analyze small changes. You search for meaning in silence. You try to figure out what you did, what changed, what you can do to fix it. And without realizing it, your focus shifts completely. You're no longer enjoying the connection. You're trying to repair it. This is where emotional addiction quietly takes hold. Not through constant pleasure, but through interrupted reward. They give you just enough to feel it again. A message that sounds like the old them. A moment of warmth that reminds you of the beginning. A glimpse of the person you thought they were. And your brain lights up. Hope returns instantly. Relief washes over you. And in that moment, everything else fades. The confusion, the distance, the inconsistency, it all feels temporary. Because you just experienced the version of them you've been chasing. And that's exactly the trap. Because now your mind links relief to their attention. Not peace, relief. Relief from the anxiety they created. Relief from the uncertainty they introduced. Relief from the emotional tension they control. And once relief becomes the reward, the cycle locks in. You start tolerating more inconsistency just to feel those moments again. You start accepting less than you deserve because your focus isn't on standards anymore. It's on getting back to that feeling. And the unpredictable nature of it makes it stronger. Because when something is guaranteed, your mind relaxes. But when something is uncertain, your mind obsesses. It checks, it waits, it anticipates, it hopes. And that constant anticipation keeps you mentally tied to them even when they're not there. You begin to measure your emotional state based on their behavior. If they're present, you feel good. If they're distant, you feel unsettled. If they're warm, you feel hopeful. If they're cold, you feel anxious. And just like that, your emotional stability is no longer yours. It's tied to someone who controls access to it. That's not connection. That's dependency. And the most dangerous part is how normal it starts to feel. You tell yourself relationships have ups and downs. You convince yourself that maybe they're just busy. You rationalize the inconsistency because you've already invested so much emotionally. And every time you justify it, you lower your threshold a little more. What once felt unacceptable starts to feel tolerable. What once felt confusing starts to feel familiar. And what once felt like a red flag starts to feel like something you just have to manage. But deep down, your body knows. It feels the tension. It feels the imbalance. It feels the constant shift between closeness and distance. That internal unease you can't quite explain. That's not overthinking. That's awareness trying to break through the pattern. Because real connection doesn't make you feel like you're constantly adjusting. It doesn't make you feel like you have to earn consistency. It doesn't leave you guessing where you stand. But in this cycle, guessing becomes part of the experience. And that uncertainty keeps you engaged. Because every time you think you've figured it out, something changes again. And that change pulls you back in. You start chasing clarity, chasing reassurance, chasing stability, from the same source that keeps taking it away. And the more you chase, the more power they have. Not because they're stronger, but because your attention is locked onto them. Your thoughts revolve around them. Your emotions react to them. Your decisions begin to include them. And they don't even have to do much anymore. The pattern does the work for them. They can disappear for a while and still remain present in your mind. They can give you the bare minimum and still feel significant in your life. Because now you're not responding to what they do, you're responding to what you hope they'll do. And hope, when it's tied to inconsistency, becomes one of the strongest emotional hooks there is. Because it keeps you invested in a future that never fully arrives. You're always almost there, almost back to how it was, almost feeling secure again, almost getting the clarity you need, but never quite reaching it. And that almost becomes the space you live in, a space where you're giving more, waiting longer, tolerating deeper, all for moments that feel smaller over time. Because the rewards don't increase, they decrease. And yet your effort increases. That imbalance is not accidental. It's the core of the cycle. The less they give, the more you try. The more you try, the more attached you become. And the more attached you become, the harder it is to step away. Because stepping away now feels like giving up something you've worked for, something you've invested in, something you believe can still go back to what it was. But what it was never stable. It was the setup. And what you're experiencing now is the maintenance of control. Because as long as you stay in the cycle, they don't have to change. They don't have to show up consistently. They don't have to meet you at your level. All they have to do is give you just enough, just in time, to keep you from leaving. And the moment you recognize that pattern, not emotionally but clearly, everything begins to shift. Because you stop interpreting their behavior as meaning something deeper. You start seeing it as repetition. You stop chasing the highs. You start questioning the lows. You stop asking how to fix it. You start asking why it exists. And that question breaks the illusion, because it takes your focus off the feeling and puts it on the pattern. And once you see the pattern for what it is, it loses its power to keep you stuck inside it. The moment you truly see it, not just feel something is wrong, not just sense the tension, but actually see the pattern for what it is, everything begins to collapse in a way you didn't expect. Because the illusion doesn't break loudly. It breaks quietly. It breaks in the space between their words and their actions. It breaks in the realization that what you kept trying to fix was never consistent to begin with. It breaks when you stop asking, "What happened to them?" and start asking, "Why did I ignore what was always there?" That shift is uncomfortable, not because it's confusing, but because it's clear. And clarity removes the emotional fog they relied on. Suddenly, the things you once justified don't feel acceptable anymore. The silence that once made you anxious now feels intentional. The distance that once made you chase now feels revealing. You start connecting moments that you previously kept separate. You see how the intensity at the beginning was followed by inconsistency? You see how every time you got close, something disrupted it. You see how your effort increased while their presence decreased. And once those pieces connect, the story changes. It's no longer a mystery, it's a pattern. And patterns don't need to be decoded emotionally, they need to be recognized. This is where their influence begins to weaken. Not because they changed, but because your perception did. Because control only works when it's unseen. Once you see it, it becomes predictable. And once it becomes predictable, it loses the ability to confuse you. You start noticing the timing of their actions, how they reappear just when you begin to detach, how they offer just enough warmth when you start to pull away, how they mirror your energy when they feel you slipping. And what once felt spontaneous now feels calculated. What once felt emotional now feels strategic. And that realization creates distance inside you, even before you physically step away. You stop reacting the same way. You pause instead of responding instantly. You observe instead of absorbing. You question instead of accepting. And that internal shift is something they can feel, even if you never say a word, because your energy changes, your availability changes, your willingness to engage in the same cycle begins to fade. And this is where they often try to regain control. They might come back stronger, more attentive, more present, more like the person you met in the beginning. And for a moment, it can feel confusing again, because it looks like change, it feels like effort, it sounds like awareness. But this is where your clarity matters most, because you're no longer looking at isolated moments. You're looking at the pattern as a whole. You're not asking, does this feel good right now? You're asking, is this consistent over time? And that question protects you, because it keeps you grounded in reality, not pulled into temporary emotion. You begin to understand that real change doesn't arrive suddenly and disappear just as fast. It doesn't show up only when you're about to leave. It doesn't depend on your distance to exist. Real consistency is steady. It's present without being triggered. It doesn't need a crisis to activate. And once you hold that standard, their attempts start to lose their impact. Because you're no longer responding to intensity. You're responding to truth. And truth is quiet. It doesn't need to impress you. It doesn't need to overwhelm you. It just needs to be consistent. And when you don't get that, you don't negotiate with it anymore. You don't try to explain yourself into being understood. You don't try to prove your worth through patience. You don't try to earn something that should be freely given. You step back, not out of anger, but out of awareness. Because you realize that staying in something that requires you to ignore yourself is no longer an option. That realization is powerful, because it shifts your focus completely, from them to you, from their behavior to your boundaries, from their inconsistency to your standards. And once that shift happens, something inside you stabilizes. You no longer feel pulled in multiple directions. You no longer feel the constant urge to check, to wait, to hope. Because your emotional state is no longer tied to their actions. You reclaim that control, quietly, firmly, without needing them to understand or agree. And that's what makes it real power. Because it doesn't depend on their response. It doesn't require closure. It doesn't need a final conversation where everything makes sense. It exists within you, as a decision, as a standard, as a line you no longer allow anyone to cross. And from that place, walking away feels different. It's not dramatic. It's not reactive. It's not fueled by anger or pain. It's grounded, clear, certain. Because you're not leaving based on a single moment. You're leaving based on a pattern you fully understand. And that understanding removes the doubt that used to pull you back. You don't wonder if things could have been different. You don't question if you gave enough. You don't replay conversations trying to find a different outcome. Because you see it for what it is, not what you hoped it could be. And that clarity creates a kind of peace that doesn't need validation, a peace that isn't loud, but steady, a peace that doesn't come from them changing, but from you seeing. And once you reach that point, something shifts permanently. You stop being available for confusion. You stop being attracted to inconsistency. You stop mistaking intensity for connection, because you've experienced what it feels like to be pulled into something that looks powerful, but drains you over time. And now you recognize the difference. You recognize that real connection feels stable. It feels safe. It feels clear. It doesn't require you to lose yourself to keep it. And once that becomes your standard, everything else falls away naturally. Not because you're forcing it, but because it no longer fits who you've become.